May 26, 1942. Hakem, North Africa. Lieutenant James Cooper of the British 4th Armoured Brigade watched through his Grant tank's periscope as German Panzer IIIs advanced across the desert 1,500 yards away. His crew was nervous. This was their first combat in the new American tank, and everything about it seemed wrong. The Grant stood 10 feet 3 inches tall, a skyscraper in tank terms. The 75mm main gun was mounted in a hull sponson that could barely traverse 30 degrees. The riveted armor was already infamous for splattering deadly fragments inside when hit. German tankers called it a mobile coffin and predicted it would burn beautifully. But Cooper had discovered something during training that the Germans didn't know. Something the tank's designers probably hadn't even intended. His Grant could shoot from positions where German tanks were completely blind. Cooper positioned his tank behind a sand ridge just tall enough to hide his hull. The Germans advancing toward him couldn't see him at all. Their low-profile Panzer IIIs needed to crest ridges to observe. But Cooper's gun, mounted 69 inches off the ground in that terrible tall hull, cleared the ridge top easily. He could see them. They couldn't see him. And his 75mm gun had 1,200 yards of effective range. Before we reveal how being too tall became a lethal advantage, demolish that subscribe button. Like and comment if you think height in tanks is always bad. This channel exposes design flaws that won battles. Now let me show you why the ugliest tank in the desert became Rommel's nightmare. The M3's story began not with brilliant design vision, but with desperate improvisation. In June 1940, as France collapsed and Britain faced potential invasion, American military planners confronted an uncomfortable reality. The United States had essentially no modern tank force. The M2 medium tank that equipped American armored units was armed with a 37mm gun that couldn't penetrate modern armor, and America's industrial base, while enormous, had never built truly effective combat tanks in quantity. The Army wanted a medium tank with a 75mm gun, the minimum caliber believed necessary to fight German panzers effectively. But there was a problem. American designers couldn't figure out how to mount a 75mm gun in a rotating turret within the weight and size constraints of a medium tank. The turret ring technology, the massive bearing that allows a turret to rotate, simply wasn't advanced enough to handle the weight and recoil forces of a 75mm gun in a turret that could fit on a 30-ton chassis. The solution, proposed by the Rock Island Arsenal design team in August 1940, was brilliantly pragmatic and horrifyingly ugly. Mount the 75mm gun in a sponson on the right side of the hull. Add a small turret on top with a 37mm gun for anti-tank work and local defense. Essentially, build a tank with two main guns pointing in slightly different directions, one that could traverse fully and one that could barely turn at all. It looked like a mechanical compromise because it absolutely was a mechanical compromise. The design was approved in April 1941 with production beginning immediately. The Army needed tanks desperately, and the M3 was a tank they could actually build with existing technology. By the time Pearl Harbor brought America into the war, production lines were already delivering M3s at a rate of 1,000 per month. The British, facing tank shortages after disastrous losses in North Africa, immediately requested as many M3s as America could spare. The British version, designated the Grant after Union General Ulysses S. Grant, featured a modified turret with a lower profile and different radio arrangement. The American version kept its tall turret and was named the Lee after Confederate General Robert E. Lee. Both shared the same fundamental design. Tall, angular, riveted armor, two main guns in an ungainly configuration that made experienced tankers wince. When the first Grants arrived in Egypt in April 1942, British tank crews examined them with mounting horror. The vehicle stood over 10 feet tall, making it an enormous target in the flat North African desert. The 75mm gun mounted in the hull sponson could only traverse 30 degrees left or right, meaning the entire tank had to turn to engage targets outside that narrow arc. Worst of all, the armor was riveted rather than welded, and everyone knew what happened when riveted armor was hit. The rivets became deadly projectiles inside the crew compartment, killing men even when the shell didn't penetrate. German intelligence officers examining reconnaissance photographs of British tank formations in May 1942 initially misidentified the Grant as a self-propelled gun rather than a proper tank. The hull-mounted 75mm and awkward profile suggested a hastily converted chassis, not a purpose-designed combat vehicle. When they realized this was indeed America's new medium tank, the assessment was withering. One Africa Corps intelligence bulletin described it as representative of American inexperience in armored warfare design, and predicted it would prove easy prey for experienced German crews. Rommel's Panzer crews shared this contempt. The Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks they operated were relatively low profile, at 8 feet 3 inches and 8 feet 8 inches tall respectively. The Grant's 10 feet 3 inches seemed absurdly vulnerable. In desert warfare, where flat terrain offered little natural cover, profile was survival. A tall tank was a dead tank, or so conventional wisdom insisted. German gunners joked that engaging a Grant would be like shooting at a barn, impossible to miss. The 75mm gun mounted in the sponson seemed like a fatal compromise. German tanks could traverse their turrets 360 degrees, engaging targets in any direction with minimal vehicle movement. The Grant's hull-mounted gun required the entire 30-ton vehicle to turn to engage targets outside its narrow traverse arc. In the fluid, fast-moving tank battles that characterized North African warfare, this seemed disastrously limiting. But the Germans had made their assessments based on assumptions about how tank battles worked. Assumptions derived from fighting on European terrain and against Soviet forces in Russia. North Africa was about to teach them that desert warfare followed different rules, and that the obvious design flaw in the Grant was actually solving a problem they hadn't properly understood. The physics of shooting from behind cover had been understood since the earliest days of artillery, but tank designers had largely ignored it. A tank engaging from behind a ridge or sand dune needs sufficient height for its gun to clear the protective terrain while keeping its vulnerable hull hidden. This is called a hull-down position, and it's one of the most powerful tactical advantages in armored warfare. The problem is that most tanks are built low specifically to minimize their profile, which means they need to expose more of themselves to shoot over cover. The Grant's ridiculous height, that design feature everyone mocked, meant its 75mm gun sat 69 inches above the ground when mounted in the hull sponson. Compare this to a Panzer III's main gun at roughly 55 inches, or a Panzer IV at 60 inches. Those 9 to 14 inches of difference sound trivial until you start doing the trigonometry of sightlines over desert terrain. A sand dune or ridge that completely concealed a German tank forced it to crest the obstacle to engage, exposing its entire hull. That same dune might hide 80% of a Grant's hull while still allowing its 75mm gun to clear the top and engage targets beyond. British tank crews discovered this advantage almost by accident during training exercises in April 1942. Lieutenant Cooper, assigned to the 4th Armored Brigade, was practicing defensive positions when he noticed something remarkable. Positioning his Grant behind a gentle rise in the desert floor, he found that his 75mm gun could engage targets over 1,000 yards away, while his hull remained almost entirely concealed. His driver couldn't even see the targets, they were below his line of sight. But Cooper, positioned high in the sponson with the gun, had clear observation and fields of fire. The tactical implications were staggering. In desert warfare, whoever sees first usually kills first. Engagements often occurred at ranges of 1,000 to 2,000 yards, where accurate gunnery and first shot hits determined survival. A tank that could observe and engage while remaining largely hidden had an almost unfair advantage. The Grant's height meant it could exploit terrain features that German tanks simply couldn't use the same way. Slight undulations in the desert floor that offered no protection to low-profile panzers became fighting positions for Grants. The 75mm M2 gun mounted in the Grant was itself a revelation to British crews accustomed to 2-pounder and 6-pounder guns. The M61 armor-piercing shell could penetrate 60mm of armor at 1,000 yards, sufficient to destroy any German tank in North Africa from the front. More importantly, the 75mm fired a devastating high-explosive shell that German tanks lacked. British tankers had been fighting a frustrating war where their guns could kill enemy tanks but were nearly useless against anti-tank guns, the real killers on the North African battlefield. The Grant could engage both effectively. The hull-mounted configuration that seemed so limiting actually provided excellent stability for accurate long-range gunnery. Because the gun was fixed to the hull rather than mounted in a rotating turret, there was less movement and vibration when firing. The sponson mounting also meant the gun could be positioned lower in the vehicle structure, reducing the distance between the gun's axis and the vehicle's center of gravity. This improved accuracy, especially when firing on the move, something German crews would discover to their considerable dismay that on May 26, 1942, during the Battle of Gazala, 167 Grant tanks of the British 4th and 22nd Armored Brigades encountered Rommel's panzer forces in the first major engagement between M3s and German armor. German tank commanders, seeing the tall, ungainly American tanks, expected easy victories. They advanced confidently, intending to close range and use their superior maneuverability and turret traverse to overwhelm the Grants. Instead, they drove into a killing field. British Grant crews had positioned themselves behind every available piece of terrain. Low ridges, sand dunes, even slight depressions where the desert floor fell away. German tanks advancing across what they perceived as open ground suddenly found themselves under accurate 75mm fire from positions they couldn't even identify. Panzers would crest small rises and immediately take hits from Grants that were firing from hull-down positions the Germans couldn't see clearly enough to engage effectively. Lieutenant Werner Schmidt of the 21st Panzer Division later described the experience in a captured diary. "We advanced toward the British positions across what appeared to be flat ground. Suddenly, shells began hitting our tanks from positions we could not identify. Our commanders ordered us to press forward to close the range, but as we crested each small rise, more fire came from positions that seemed impossible. The American tanks were firing from behind terrain features we had dismissed as insignificant. The engagement at point 187, a slight elevation southeast of Bir Hakeim, demonstrated the Grants' tactical advantage in perfect detail. German Panzer IIIs advancing from the west encountered Grant tanks positioned on the reverse slope of the rise. The Germans could see the tops of the Grant turrets, but not the hulls or the deadly 75mm sponson guns. As German tanks crested the rise to engage what they could see, they exposed their entire hulls to Grant crews who'd been waiting in perfect hull-down positions. The mathematics of the engagement were brutal. Grant tanks firing from defilade, military term for protected positions, could engage at their maximum effective range while presenting minimal target. German tanks trying to return fire had to expose themselves completely, offering their full profile to enemy gunners. In the first 30 minutes of combat at point 187, 12 Panzer IIIs were destroyed for the loss of 3 Grants. The kill ratio that emerged from Gazala was approximately 2-to-1 in favor of the British. Remarkable given that German crews were considered among the best trained in the world. But the Grants' advantages weren't limited to static defensive positions. British commanders discovered that the tank's height provided another unexpected benefit: superior observation. Tank commanders positioned atop the Grant's tall hull could see farther across the desert than crews in lower vehicles. In the dust and heat haze that characterized North African combat, the ability to spot enemy forces even a few hundred yards sooner meant the difference between ambushing and being ambushed. Captain Douglas Lang, commanding a Grant squadron in the 22nd Armored Brigade, developed tactics that exploited this observation advantage. His tanks would advance in a line with commanders scanning the horizon from their elevated positions. When enemy tanks were spotted, the Grants would immediately position themselves hull down using the microterrain features that dotted the desert, slight ridges, old wadi beds, even the shadows created by the angle of the sun on undulating ground. German tanks, lower to the ground, often didn't spot British forces until they were already being engaged. The 37mm gun mounted in the Grant's turret, initially dismissed as redundant, proved valuable in these engagements. While the 75mm engaged enemy armor from hull-down positions, the 37mm could traverse to deal with closer threats, German anti-tank guns, infantry, or enemy tanks that managed to close range. This two-gun system meant a Grant could engage multiple targets simultaneously or maintain suppressive fire with the 37mm while reloading the 75mm. German tactical adjustments began appearing within weeks of the Gazala engagements. Afrika Korps intelligence bulletins issued in June 1942 warned Panzer crews that the Grant tank possesses unexpected capability in defensive positions and should be engaged at maximum range whenever possible. The document advised avoiding advances across open terrain when Grants were known to be present and recommended using artillery to suppress Grant positions before tank assaults. This was a remarkable reversal. The Germans were now treating the terrible American tank with the kind of respect they'd previously reserved only for the heaviest British armor. Rommel himself, in correspondence with the High Command, noted that the Grant's 75mm gun had restored parity to British armored forces, and that its defensive use of terrain was unexpectedly sophisticated. This from a commander who'd spent 18 months dominating British armor with inferior numbers. The Grant hadn't just survived its combat debut, it had forced one of Germany's most successful commanders to fundamentally reassess British armored capability. The First Battle of El Alamein in July 1942 provided the ultimate validation of the Grant's unusual design. Rommel's Afrika Korps, having pushed deep into Egypt, attempted to break through the Alamein defensive line and reach the Nile Delta. British forces, now equipped with significant numbers of Grants, established defensive positions along a 40-mile front from the Mediterranean coast to the impassable Qattara Depression. The terrain was ideal for the Grant's tactical employment, gently undulating desert with countless small wadis, ridges, and depressions that provided hull-down positions. On July 1st, the 21st Panzer Division launched a major assault against the Grant-equipped 22nd Armored Brigade near Deir el-Shine. German intelligence had estimated roughly 40 Grants in the sector and planned to overwhelm them through superior tactics and concentrated assault. What they didn't know was that British commanders had learned to position Grants in depth, multiple layers of hull-down positions, so that even if German tanks overran the first line, they'd immediately come under fire from a second-line position behind additional terrain features. The German assault collapsed in stages. The first wave of Panzer IIIs crested initial ridgelines and immediately took fire from Grants positioned 800 to 1,000 yards away. German commanders ordered their tanks to close range, believing that mobility and turret traverse would prevail once they engaged at shorter distances. But as they advanced, they discovered that each piece of cover they crossed exposed them to more Grants positioned in carefully prepared positions behind terrain they hadn't even recognized as tactically significant. Hauptmann Friedrich von Mellenthin, a senior intelligence officer with the Afrika Korps, later wrote about the engagement. The Grant tanks were positioned with an understanding of terrain that we had not anticipated. Every slight undulation concealed a tank that could fire over the obstruction while remaining largely protected. Our tanks were forced to expose themselves to engage, while the enemy remained in advantageous positions throughout the battle. By July 3rd, Rommel's offensive had ground to a halt. German tank losses exceeded 100 vehicles, with Grant tanks accounting for a disproportionate share of the kills. British losses were also significant, roughly 60 tanks, but the critical difference was tactical. German tanks had been destroyed while advancing across exposed ground, trying to close with an enemy that could engage them from protected positions. British tanks had been lost when forced into disadvantageous positions or caught by German anti-tank guns. The Grant's design advantages had fundamentally altered the tactical equation of desert warfare. The psychological impact on German crews was profound. Tankers who'd confidently engaged British cruiser tanks and Matildas now approached battles with Grants cautiously, knowing that the tall, mobile coffin could kill them from positions they couldn't effectively engage. One captured German tank commander stated during interrogation, "We were told the American tank was poorly designed and vulnerable. In defensive positions, it is neither. It shoots from places where we must expose ourselves to return fire." But the Grant's design limitations remained real and occasionally catastrophic. The riveted armor that crews feared proved as deadly as predicted. When armor-piercing rounds struck the hull, rivets would shear off and ricochet inside the crew compartment with lethal velocity. Several Grant crews were killed or wounded by their own armor's fasteners rather than by shell fragments. The 75mm gun's limited traverse meant that in fluid, close-range engagements, Grants were vulnerable to more maneuverable German tanks that could circle to flanking positions faster than the massive hull could rotate. The Grants that fought at Alam Halfa in late August and early September 1942 showed both the vehicle's strengths and its fundamental obsolescence. British forces, now under Montgomery's command, had prepared defensive positions in depth along the Alam Halfa ridge. Grant tanks were dug into carefully prepared hull-down positions that maximized their height advantage while minimizing exposure. When Rommel's forces attacked on August 31st, they encountered Grant fire from ranges where German tanks struggled to identify targets through dust and heat haze. The battle was a decisive British victory, with German forces losing over 50 tanks while inflicting lighter casualties. Yet by this point, the first M4 Sherman tanks were arriving in Egypt. The Sherman solved every design compromise that had plagued the Grant, fully traversing turret with a 75mm gun, lower profile, welded armor, better protection. British commanders began transitioning Grant units to Shermans as quickly as supplies allowed. The tank that had saved the 8th Army was being retired after barely 6 months of combat service. Not because it had failed, but because better designs had finally caught up to battlefield requirements. The Grant service record shows 1,386 were delivered to British forces, with peak strength of approximately 300 operational vehicles reached in July 1942. By November 1942, during the Second Battle of El Alamein, fewer than 170 Grants remained in frontline service, replaced by Shermans and British-built Churchill and Crusader tanks. The American military never deployed M3 Lees in significant numbers to North Africa, preferring to wait for Sherman production to ramp up. The Pacific Theater revealed another unexpected aspect of the Grant's capabilities. In Burma and the Southwest Pacific, where jungle terrain and steep hillsides dominated, the M3's height became useful for entirely different reasons. Australian and British forces fighting in New Guinea discovered that the Grant's tall profile allowed commanders to observe over dense jungle canopy in ways that lower tanks couldn't match. The 75mm high-explosive shells proved devastating against Japanese bunkers and fortified positions, with the hull mounting providing stable fire platforms on uneven jungle terrain. The Red Army received 1,386 cubic meters Lees under Lend-Lease, making the Soviet Union actually the largest operator of the type. Soviet crews had mixed feelings about their gift from America. The height was initially seen as suicidal given German anti-tank proficiency on the Eastern Front. But Soviet commanders discovered that in defensive operations, particularly in the rolling terrain of Ukraine and southern Russia, the Lee's ability to shoot from hull-down positions offered tactical advantages. Soviet after-action reports from 1942 to 1943 noted that Lee tanks achieved favorable kill ratios when employed in prepared defensive positions, though they suffered heavy losses when forced into offensive operations. The Free French forces in North Africa operated Grants with considerable success. General Philippe Leclerc's 2nd Armored Division included Grant tanks that fought from Tunisia through to the liberation of Paris. French crews, many of whom had experience with interwar French tanks that featured similar hull-mounted guns, adapted quickly to the Grant's quirks. Several French Grant commanders noted that the tank's flaws were obvious, but its ability to kill German armor from protected positions made it valuable despite the limitations. By early 1943, Grant production had ceased entirely, with all M3 manufacturing capacity shifted to Sherman production. The total production run reached 6,258 vehicles between April 1941 and December 1942, a remarkable achievement for a design that had been conceived barely 2 years before the first example rolled off the assembly line. This production surge had arguably saved the British position in North Africa during the critical summer of 1942 when defeat seemed imminent. The tactical lessons learned from Grant operations influenced American tank doctrine for the remainder of the war. The importance of hull-down fighting positions became a central element of defensive tactics. Tank commanders were trained to identify and exploit terrain features that allowed engaging while minimizing exposure. The concept that height could be an advantage rather than purely a liability, when properly employed in appropriate terrain, challenged conventional wisdom about tank design priorities. German intelligence assessments of the Grant evolved significantly between May 1942 and the vehicle's retirement from frontline service. Final evaluations acknowledged that while the Grant possessed significant design limitations, its employment by British forces had been unexpectedly effective in the defensive battles of 1942. One captured document noted that the Grant had forced German forces to develop new tactics for engaging hull-down armor and had temporarily restored British armored capability at a critical moment in the North African campaign. The M3 Grant's legacy extends far beyond its brief combat career. It represents a crucial lesson about military technology that remains relevant today. Sometimes the wrong design is exactly right for the actual circumstances you face, rather than the circumstances you expected. The Grant wasn't the tank American designers wanted to build. It was the tank they could build with available technology in the time available, designed to solve the immediate crisis of having no effective medium tanks whatsoever. That improvised design happened to possess characteristics that proved unexpectedly valuable in North African terrain. The excessive height that should have been a fatal vulnerability became a tactical advantage when British crews learned to exploit hull-down positions. The awkward hull-mounted gun that seemed like obsolete thinking provided a stable, high-firing platform that could engage over terrain features German tanks had to crest completely. Design flaws became design features through intelligent tactical employment. Lieutenant Cooper, who discovered the Grant's hull-down advantages during training, survived the North African campaign and later reflected on his experience. "We were told the Grant was a terrible tank, a stopgap until proper tanks arrived. And it was terrible in many ways, tall, awkward, dangerous to crew when hit. But in the summer of 1942, it was exactly what we needed. It could kill German tanks from positions where they couldn't effectively return fire. That single capability was worth all its flaws combined." The Grant's combat record speaks to effectiveness rather than elegance. During the critical period from May through September 1942, when British fortunes in North Africa hung by a thread, Grants formed the backbone of 8th Army's armored force. They fought at Gazala, First Alamein, and Alam Halfa, 3 battles that collectively stopped Rommel's advance toward the Suez Canal and set conditions for the eventual Allied victory. Without the Grant's arrival in April 1942, British forces would have faced Rommel's summer offensive with only cruiser tanks and Matildas, vehicles that were demonstrably outmatched by German armor. The statistical analysis is revealing. Grant tanks achieved kill-to-loss ratios averaging 2-to-1 in defensive engagements during 1942, compared to roughly 1-to-2 ratios for British cruiser tanks in similar situations. This dramatic improvement wasn't because the Grant was a better tank in absolute terms. The Sherman that replaced it was superior in almost every measure. The improvement came from tactical exploitation of the Grant's specific characteristics in terrain that favored those characteristics. Modern military historians studying the Grant's combat performance have identified it as a textbook example of fitness for purpose in weapons design. The tank wasn't fit for the purpose of being the best medium tank in the world. The Sherman would fill that role within months. It was fit for the purpose of keeping Britain in the North African War during the 6 months when defeat seemed imminent and no better alternative existed. For that specific purpose, in that specific terrain, at that specific moment, the Grant was remarkably effective. The design philosophy behind the Grant influenced post-war American tank development in subtle ways. The experience demonstrated that American industry could rapidly design, produce, and field effective armor even when technological constraints prevented ideal solutions. This confidence in improvisation and rapid iteration became characteristic of American military equipment development. The Grant also validated the importance of observation and firing height, factors that influenced the relatively tall profiles of post-war American tanks like the M60 and M1 Abrams. German veterans interviewed after the war offered surprisingly balanced assessments. One former Panzer commander stated, "The Grant was not a good tank by our standards of what a tank should be, but British crews used it intelligently, exploiting its strengths and minimizing its weaknesses. We learned not to underestimate vehicles that seemed poorly designed, because design that seems poor for one mission might be excellent for another." The last combat use of M3 Lee/Grant tanks occurred in 1945 in Burma, where British forces operated a handful of Grants in supporting roles. By that point, they were thoroughly obsolete, survivors from an earlier era when desperation drove design and compromise was the only option. But they'd done their job. They'd arrived when needed, fought effectively in the terrain where deployed, and bought time for better designs to reach the battlefield. The Grant story demonstrates a truth that military planners sometimes forget. The best weapon isn't always the most sophisticated or the most theoretically superior. Sometimes the best weapon is the one that exists, can be produced in quantity, and possesses characteristics that match the actual terrain and tactical situation. The Grant was tall when doctrine said tanks should be low. It mounted a gun in the hull when doctrine said guns belonged in turrets. It looked wrong, fought awkwardly, and should have been a disaster. Instead, it saved an army, stopped a legendary commander, and forced one of history's most professional military forces to rewrite their tactics. All because it could shoot over sand dunes that German tanks couldn't. Sometimes the flaw everyone sees is actually the advantage nobody understood. Sometimes being too tall is exactly tall enough. And sometimes the ugliest tank in the desert becomes the one the enemy learns to fear most, not despite its design compromises, but because those compromises created capabilities nobody expected.